Clear prop.
Star 738 Yankee number 2 following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
Fantastic. Another show today. Today we're going to talk about a potpourri of things, we'll call it. But you wanted to start off telling a story about a recent check ride, and we'll dive into the things that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I just want to talk about, I was doing an instrument check ride here a couple of weeks ago, and we were doing an ILS approach at a local airport. And I tell applicants on an instrument check ride that it's okay for there to be silence in the cockpit. And in fact, especially on an instrument check ride, there's going to be times of possibly awkward silence. And a lot of my applicants just, they can't stand that. They feel like they have to be talking or there needs to be chatter going on all the time. The problem with talking is, for the most part, if you're talking, you're not listening. Okay, we've got 2 ears and we've got 1 mouth, so listening might be more important than talking. There are a lot of things that we learn with our ears. As I sit in this room recording, I just heard an airplane start up outside, and I'm thinking, okay, well, somebody's going flying as we're sitting in a room, and honestly, I'm a little envious because we got beautiful weather. I'd love to be out there flying right now. But anyway, we pick up on cues like this. And so what happened, the gentleman was doing a very admirable job on the check ride. We're flying an ILS approach, and we're about probably about 8 miles from the end of the runway, about to intercept the glide slope to start going down on the approach. And the approach that we were using was to a runway that was not the primary landing runway at the other airport. We were doing an approach to ILS runway 14, and most of the landings were to 19 this day. The winds were about 200 at 12 knots. In any event, as we were about 8 miles out, air traffic control called us up, and they asked my guy to speed up. I forgot the exact verbiage, but they asked him to speed up, and he said unable. Now, that's perfectly within your rights as a pilot to tell him unable, and if you're unable, you should tell him that you're unable. And that's what he told him, and I think what he heard was literal. He heard from ATC that they wanted us to go faster, and he said, well, we can't go faster. Well, what I heard was they wanted us to go faster because we had a possible traffic conflict. And so when I heard him tell him unable, I, of course, as just the neutral observer, I'm just sitting there, and I said, okay, well, we'll see how this thing plays out. And I'm imagining the controller in the tower trying to do his calculations to figure out if we're going to meet at the airport at the same time with another airplane. Well, not long after that, I hear a jet call up and check in with approach, and they are out on the approach to the other runway, doing an RNAV approach. And it's visual conditions. Weather was fine.
I assume you weren't doing a check ride in a jet, so they were going faster.
Right. And what the controller said to the jet is, we have a Cessna on a 7-mile final to intersecting runway, and you're doing 70 knots faster than he is. Can you pull back to your final approach speed? And you hear the jet pilot reluctantly agree to that, and which he did. And I'm still thinking to myself, okay, this may not work out, and in all likelihood, priority will be given to the jet over us. And we weren't planning on landing. We were planning on doing a missed approach and then going to another airport anyway. And probably when we were about 1,200 feet, which was about 4 miles out, ATC came on and told us they needed us to break off the approach 2 miles from the approach end of the runway and fly an amended missed approach procedure. All of this was things that I was ready for. I was prepared for, just because and experience goes a long way. Of course, I've done this thousands of times, and my applicant, had flown, he's gotten his instrument training. He's getting an instrument rating. And he wasn't expecting this, and he was a little bit confused over what ATC wanted him to do. And so he queried the tower again. He said, say again, tower. And the tower said, we need you to break off the approach at 2 miles from the runway. And at that point, I just told him, I says, I'll tell you when to go, Mr. Approach. And so my whole point is that, and this is what we debriefed when we got back on the ground, which he did a fine job on the check ride. And I was just explaining to him, I said, when approach asked you to slow down or speed up rather, I said he had a reason for wanting you to speed up. And I think what pilots think is that the most conservative course of action is always the most safest course of action. And it's a little bit of a gray area. I'll never forget on a private check ride one time I gave a young man a cross-country trip that was about 500 miles, and he planned about 5 fuel stops. And I asked him, why so many fuel stops? And he said, well, I don't want to land with less than 3.5 hours worth of fuel. And I said, why? And he kept throwing up the safety word. Well, I want it to be safe. And I asked him, I said, at what phase of flight do you think the most accidents happen? He says, well, takeoff and landing. And I said, so now we have taken a trip that we could have done in 2 takeoffs and landings, and instead we've done 5 takeoffs and landings. So we've more than doubled our exposure to error in takeoffs and landings. And he said, well, gee, I never thought of it that way. So what we may think is always the safest course of action, there may be extenuating circumstances, there may be external circumstances to think about. And this was one where, if the applicant didn't feel like he could speed up, that's fine. Don't speed up. That's the bottom line.
Well, and they had Wally in the aircraft with them. They knew they were on a check ride, so they probably wouldn't have tried something they had never tried before.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
It's a good point. 24,000 hours and 140 hours. You guys are thinking very different things.
Right.
And I think that's kind of the topic for today is how can we, the 2 guys at Behind the Prop, give all you listeners some ideas and ways to use some resources in the cockpit to the best of your ability, whether it's some local knowledge and taking what ATC is sharing with you and doing some mental gymnastics to figure out what's best for me in the situation,
right?
To make the best decision. It may still always be unable for this
right.
gentleman, but as he gets more and more down the road or down the runway in his career, he might change that some.
Right.
And I think pre-show we talked about it. We're going to break it up into really 3 parts, and we may jump around a little bit, but we're going to talk about how to use your ears and radios, some other stuff in the cockpit, and then how to maybe take advantage of some navigational tools in ways that you might not be doing. Maybe you are doing some of these. And as always, we would love the conversation to continue online, whether that's emails. We love getting notes and love responding to your questions and using them on future shows. But Wally just gave a really good example of how he was using the radios in a very different way than the applicant was, and had a lot of information that maybe wasn't going through the applicant's mind. Likewise, on a recent flight that I took, I was in the cockpit observing just the other pilot was piloting command, and they had asked for a little bit of help, and I was just watching, and we were approaching an airport, and the tower, we had just been switched to tower on a flight following, and the tower said, enter or report when you're turning base. And we'd already been talking about briefing and some other things. And what was interesting was 3 minutes or so later, the pilot had convinced themselves that they had heard left or right base. Sorry, right base. They heard the tower say right base. And I'm thinking through it, and I'm thinking we're never turning right base. The way we're coming in is like almost on a long left base, but we're going to make a little bit of a turn. So I know what I think the tower is asking for, and I let things continue to progress a little bit more. We're still 10 miles out, and we get closer and closer. I said, when are we going to be on right base? And she's thinking through it and talking to herself, and ultimately she realized never. And what I think happens is she heard right base because she in her mind had already briefed that she was going to be turning a right base, but that's not what they wanted us to do. And that didn't make sense. There were other reasons why she talked herself into this right base, but you can't add words. Like, you got to really listen. And I think these two examples are ones that we want to share, that you really got to listen and not add to it. I think a lot of times we're better known for adding words that aren't necessary to our speech, but I think that we really have to think about not adding words to things we hear, both on the ground and in the air, for sure.
Right.
Also, on that same trip for me, something that I don't think people do, but I'm sure we've all been asked or taught to do it, is really use our radios as early as possible, right? And in this one instance, we were coming back to this airport, and I turned the radio to tower probably 25 miles out. We were a long way away, but I knew they were busy. I could see the traffic on my screen on ForeFlight, and I just wanted to be listening in case anything important came up. And lo and behold, something came up when we were about 17 miles out. We would not normally be talking to tower yet. We hadn't reported in that we were inbound, and they called our tail sign. ADSB is a great thing. They called our tail sign and said, if you're listening, turn 10 degrees to the right to avoid traffic, right? Which was fantastic that we were on the channel, which saved us probably a little bit of headache, and that was very nice of the tower to do. We were actually flying with another pilot. Maybe they were 3 miles in front of us. They were also told the same information, but didn't hear that information because they weren't listening. But he probably was listening a few miles later. Right. But use those radios to your advantage, right? I'm sure we all do it in some way, but weather as soon as you can. We talked about using the radios to listen to emergency and other things on other podcasts, but I think getting on the future channel a little bit earlier is better for everybody.
Yeah.
For sure. We talked about practice approaches. You gave a tip about if you go the Navasota Conroe Hooks route, what do you suggest your CFI students you're teaching? What do you suggest they do?
Well, we know here in Houston or in this area, a lot of times we go. We do an approach in Conroe, followed by an approach in Hooks, and Hooks Airport is located. Was it 17 miles?
It's close.
Something like that.
9 minutes maybe, yeah, about that.
Yeah, about 17 miles southwest of Conroe Airport. So a lot of times we do an approach to the south into Conroe, followed by an approach to the south into Hooks. And things happen fast on that between Conroe and here. And typically ATC, once you check in with approach, Conroe Tower hands you over to approach. You call up Houston approach. Houston approach will normally, if they know what you want to do, if you talked to them previously, they'll say, clear direct oiler, advise when you have information Charlie at Hooks. And at this point, the student is probably kind of fumbling to find oiler, find the approach, going through the database, trying to fly a heading, trying to fly an altitude, because everything is happening at the same time. And the last thing that you're thinking about is flipping over to the ATIS and picking up information Charlie. So if you can get information Charlie before you even go to the first airport, before you even go to Conroe, go ahead and get Charlie at that point. Now, there's a chance that maybe it's already changed to Delta, and when you check in with them, say we have information Charlie. If it's information Delta, the controller is probably going to tell you what the difference is.
Oh, yeah. They'll read the winds and everything, more than likely.
Probably not a whole lot of difference. It could be. But, if it's information Delta, they say, they'll just say Delta's current altimeter is 29 or 89er.
Yeah, I just thought of another one that recently happened with that. I had some passengers, and we did the corridor, which is getting the ability to fly right through downtown Houston and see the big buildings, and took them to the monument. We turned around and we were coming back, and they live in Sugar Land, so I already knew I was going to Sugar Land. So pretty much, and this was 15 minutes after the hour we were in the air, as soon as we got airborne and on approach, I started listening to the Sugar Land weather, because I knew I was going to turn away from Sugar Land and come right back to it. The weather wasn't going to change in 30 minutes. So I had the weather, and they said, the passengers asked me, why are you listening to Sugar Land? We're not going there first. And they were trying to pick up on all going on. And I was like, yeah, but it's not going to change in the next 15 minutes, so I'm going to be prepared. And I think that's just what we do. The more professional and the better we get at being pilots, we think ahead like that.
Right. It's just anticipation.
That's it. And I think I've observed that with you and other professional pilots around me that are so far out in front of the airplane. We hear about this when we're private pilots, stay out in front of the airplane. You're way out in front of the airplane compared to even me today, but I'm way out in front of the airplane compared to someone who's got 30 or 40 hours.
Right.
And I think that's what we're all striving to do, is get a little bit further out in front of it so that things aren't speeding up and catching up with us.
Here's another little technique. Let's say you come into a Class D airport or Class C, an airport where ATC gives you a squawk, and maybe you're on an IFR flight plan, but you have something other than 1200 in the transponder. After you land and you park the airplane, put that transponder back to 1200, because what you're doing is you're helping the next guy that flies the airplane, who might be you. If you're going out VFR, it's all set and it's ready for you. But the other thing is if you're going out IFR, all you got to do is look over that transponder and realize that the transponder is not set.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good one. And as a flight school owner who flies my own planes quite a bit, it's frustrating when I go out there and I sit down and I turn that thing on and it's got 5326. Like, come on, man.
Yeah.
That tells me you didn't do the checklist when you cleaned up the aircraft. I always strive to keep it a little nicer than it was when I got it, right? So we can do that.
I did find that when I was in an aircraft partnership, all three of the owners, I know each guy really took a lot of pride in getting that airplane pristine when we got it in. And now that I'm not in a partnership, I find myself a little lacking on that. And I kind of wish I could go back to that, because, boy, when we got that airplane and we scrubbed it, there was not a bug on the airplane when we left it.
Yep, you feel accountable that you don't want them to be ragging on you next time they see you, for sure.
Right.
Some other tips about staying in front of the aircraft. This is the stuff section. We talked about it a little bit before we started recording, but when I was a 45 to 60-hour pilot, I had a lot of cheat sheets that I wrote and had on my own knee board. Anything that would help me be a little bit more out in front of that aircraft. Radio numbers. I flew to Austin for the first time. I think I had every small airport and VOR between here and Austin, and probably 100 miles the other side of Austin, and about 50 miles both ways, right?
Right. Now
we all just pack in ForeFlight and we get that downloaded. But I had them written down, typed out in ForeFlight. I had everything at my fingertips. You talked about you have everything still in your notes for a trip to here in Monroe, because you make that trip often.
Yeah.
It's a great backup even for a professional pilot to have some of those cheat sheets.
Yeah.
The one that I think's missed over and over and over again, because we are always at this airport, is the use of a taxi diagram.
Yeah.
And that could really bite you one day, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, in fact, required on all the check rides. It does say use, I forgot how it's exactly worded in the ACS, but it does say that you are required to have a taxi diagram available to you, and that you can view.
Yeah, most of us probably do that in ForeFlight. ForeFlight automatically does it, but I would challenge you, while you're listening, do you really look down at it? Do you stop when you have the opportunity to stop, clear the runway, and know exactly what you're going to do. I think that's one of those listening things too. We also sometimes maybe have a bias to previously being told Juliet Echo Papa. Here, Juliet Echo Papa. How many times have you heard Juliet Echo Papa? Well, it might not be Juliet Echo Papa. It could very easily be Foxtrot Hotel Mike to parking. Right. That's very different.
Right.
And if you're just in that mindset of I'm going to go the same way I've always gone, that could be a real problem.
Yeah.
And you have to make sure you're not caught into that bias. And please clean up 1200, especially if you're a student at this flight school. How about some navigational stuff? I get asked this question a lot when I fly people in the 182. I try never to leave a seat open. If I'm going to fly somewhere by myself, I try to take a student or a friend or somebody to get some time in that aircraft. And I talk about the autopilot a lot. I try to teach the autopilot, but I'm constantly hitting the heading bug. On that G1000, if you hit the heading bug, the bug goes right to what you're on at that moment in time. And people always ask, what are you doing? Why am I doing that? The autopilot's flying the plane. Why do you need the heading bug? And it's something that I've just been in habit of. Someone taught me, obviously, but what if the autopilot stops working? What if I take it off autopilot? What if I'm flying on autopilot and they tell me to divert 10 degrees, so I take it off for a little bit, or I change the heading and I turn the heading bug back? I want to know what it was flying before so that I can fly it again. And it's really about if the autopilot quits or I turn it off for some reason, it's got a wind correction built into it. The computer's really, really smart. It knows exactly what it needs to fly. Yeah. And if anything happens, I just use the heading bug. It's just the best practice. Yeah. And I would say all-encompassing, the heading bug is the best practice.
Yeah, and with my airline, I mean that is our practice. Most of the time, the mode that we are flying in is called LNAV, which stands for lateral navigation. And in most general aviation airplanes, you just have a nav function. But our practice is to keep the heading bug straight ahead where you're going all the time, even though we're not actually in the heading mode. But there are a lot of times where ATC will say fly present heading. And in that case, all you have to do is go up and engage heading, and you're already, it's already set.
Right.
So, but the other thing it does do is it gives you a very good idea of where the wind is coming from. You may not have all the fancy equipment where you can actually see the display of the wind, but if you see that, we're going straight ahead, but our heading is 10 degrees to the left, we know that we've got some sort of a wind out of the left. And then you could compare your true airspeed to your ground speed and kind of figure out, well, is that coming from the front end to the left or from the tail end to the left? Obviously, if your ground speed is greater than your true airspeed, well, it's coming. We've got a little bit of a tailwind, left quartering tailwind.
No doubt. And I think you should be using the heading bug before you take off, just get the runway heading in there. Yeah. I use it for a lot of different things. If I'm on an approach, I normally would put it into what I'm going to be turning to next if I don't have an HSI or something that's going to help me do some of that as well. So I think it's a tool that goes unused. And if you have a heading bug, just make sure you're using it. Definitely goes unused.
I fly get to fly in a lot of airplanes that don't have autopilots, but they do have heading bugs. And I would say at the private pilot level, maybe 15 to 20% of the people actually use the heading bug. I mean, and we'll get to the point where I'll put the applicant under the hood and I'll give them headings. Turn right heading 320. And they're turning to 320, and you got this beautiful heading bug that would mark 320. And
still don't use it.
Still don't use it, no.
Well, that's too bad for them.
Yeah.
You should use the heading bug.
Yeah.
Likewise, on a GPS, if there's a GPS in the airplane, use the GPS. At least navigate with it. If you're going to an airport, obviously Direct 2 is the easiest thing to do. But I find that people, when they get towards the airport environment, they don't load the approaches. I think we've talked about this before, but why not load the RNAV approach into the GPS? It definitely is going to help you find the airport.
Yeah.
You might have extended lines on your ForeFlight in your iPad, but man, if it tells you right where to turn, it's a lot easier to find the airport.
Yeah.
You don't have to fly the whole approach. You're using it for situational awareness.
Right.
But man, it really does tell you when you're getting really close to the runway however far out that RNAV approach goes, right?
Yeah.
So take advantage of that. There's probably an OBS mode in every GPS too. You can turn that on and pick almost any waypoint and an item to intersect if you needed to from a navigational perspective.
Right.
And then the last one that I think we'll talk about was really the autopilot. It came up recently where I was flying with someone. They didn't have a lot of autopilot experience. I'm sure you can find a video on almost anything. They all have about the same 8 buttons. They probably all have at least 2 of the same features. Wings level and a heading probably, maybe not altitude, maybe not a lot of vertical speed stuff. But if they do, they're all going to work real similar.
Yeah.
And it's a tool that you just should take advantage of no matter what. I hear it all the time. Well, I'm such a great pilot, I'm just going to hand fly this baby the whole way. That's not always going to be the best solution because you could get stressed out really quick in some IMC.
Yeah. And what I see on instrument check rides, or what I hear, a lot of times the applicant will say, well, I got an airplane autopilot in my airplane. Am I allowed to use it? Well, the answer is yes. And not only are you allowed to use it, I'm required to test you on it if it's part of the airplane. So we're going to use the autopilot. I mean, it is a tool. I mean, most of us probably have dishwashers in our house. I would venture to say most of us use the dishwashers in our house. At some point it's brand new. It may have a lot of fancy buttons, but you're going to figure out how to use it. It's a tool. Yeah.
And I think it would be crazy to wash all your dishes. If you had a dishwasher, it'd be crazy to hand fly the whole flight if you had an autopilot. So
yeah.
Very similar topics there. So I think we don't really even know what we're going to call the show yet. It's just a bunch of cockpit best practices. It's not really how to use your single pilot resource management all up, but it is some tips and tricks that we've seen over the last few weeks that we wanted to share with everyone about how to use your ears to really hear what's going on the radios, how to use some cheat sheets and tools that you might make yourself in the cockpit, and how to take advantage of all that navigational equipment to get information that you might not easily get without it, but it will help you navigate and get to some location a whole lot easier. As always, thanks for listening, and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.